Hello everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at how to create our own Ruby gems. We'll be doing this with a fairly contrived example, which is a small little bit of Ruby code that we have right here, where a junior dev insists on mutating an array that we really don't want mutated. So finally we snap and we implement a method for deep freezing our arrays, which is totally not necessary, but for the sake of this example, bear with me. And then we can use that method to deep freeze our arrays. So what do I mean here? Well, in this application, when we create a post, there's a list of allowed titles. In this case, it's just, the typical titles you might have, like doctor, professor. And what we have down here is the junior dev in the initializer is mutating the allowed titles by adding test into this. Means you get these posts that have test in the title. We don't want that. We only want professors in the title for whatever reason. Again, like I said, contrived. So right now with this code and the little bit of patching that the junior dev has done, they can put test in the title, case in the body, click create post, and that'll work just fine. If we uncomment this and use the method coming from our Ruby gem that we'll create, we can then try to do this again, and we'll see that we're already getting an error that says you can't modify this frozen array. So the code doesn't even run, which means they'll never get far enough to have this working. So the reason why we're doing it like this is because it's a usable bit of code that we can play around with, might learn a thing or two, and it just allows us to see how we can actually use a gem. For this, we're going to be pushing the gem up to GitHub. So I have this demo code right here already on GitHub. We'll create a similar repository. We'll create a gem, and then we'll go from there. So to get started, we're just going to go ahead and stop our server. We'll cd out of this Rails app and out of this demo project, and then we'll do a make dir for a video. We'll then cd into video, and then in here we need to go ahead and create our gem. So to do this, we're going to do bundle gem, and then we're going to call this something. I'm going to call it deep_freeze. We can go ahead and run that. After you run it, the first time it might ask you a couple of different setup questions from what I recall, where it might ask you like if you want to use Rubocop or anything else. Just go through the options. If you don't have a preference, it really doesn't matter. In my case, I have it set to use Rubocop. It's set to use GitHub Actions or whatever, I think, for the continuous integration, etc. But now that we have this, we can also see right here I have Rubocop enabled and the MIT license and stuff like that. We can now go ahead, hit LL, and we can see our deep freeze project. So we'll cd into deep freeze, which is our gem file. We can go ahead and open this. Our gem folder. And I'll move my notes over here just so we can use those later. So inside of our gem directory, we can see a couple things. One is the lib directory. We'll come back to this. We don't really talk about bin here or sig, so you can just ignore those for now. Spec is your tests if you went with RSpec, which is one of the options. And then down here we have a bunch of other stuff. The main one you want to look at is going to be whatever you called your project .gemspec. You're going to want to open this. There's going to be a whole bunch of different options in here. It's going to be like the name of the gem, the authors, the email. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this since I'm pushing it up to GitHub. The summary, you're going to want to change this to whatever you would like. In my case, I'll just put some nonsense in here. So I'll just say nonsense. I'll just copy this. If you have any to-dos in here, it's probably going to be upset with you. So just make sure that this is all meaningful information, etc. Allowed host really doesn't matter. We'll just go ahead and remove this for now. We can then take our homepage. That's still our, that's actually our homepage up there, and our VS Code just crashed. So let me go ahead and move this over again and bring this over here. So we have our homepage, we have our source code URI. This is your public repo. You're going to want to make sure this matches whatever you're creating. So in our case, we're going to create a new repo for this. So we're going to go ahead and go over to github.new. Takes us straight to the GitHub new project repository, and we'll do deep_freeze_gem. That's what we'll call this. We can then come down here, click create repository. We can then come into our terminal. We're in the deep freeze repository. So let me go ahead and let me finish filling out this information with our source code. We'll grab this GitHub repo URL, just put that right here. We'll grab that same thing for the changelog, put it right here. And our home page is also going to be this GitHub repo. So we can just go ahead and save that. Now we'll do a git add dot, git commit -m. We'll say init commit. And then we can do a copy down here on the second block. We can then right click on our terminal, hit enter, and then optionally hit yes if it asks you for it. And then you can go ahead and clear your console. We can go ahead and refresh our terminal or our GitHub page, and we can see this is up here. So now we have that working. Let's go ahead and let's actually make this gem. Now making this gem is pretty simple. All we have to do is come up here to our Explorer. Inside of our lib, you have your name of your project in a RB file and a directory. Inside the directory is where the rest of your stuff will go, including a version .rb file that you want to edit as you change your versions. And the actual project name here, this is like your entry point. This is where you're going to put in all of your relevant code. So in our case, there's really only one method we're going to be using, which is going to be, we'll get rid of this class error stuff right here. It's going to just be a deep freeze that takes in an object. We then create a quick little switch case for our object. And then we say when the object is basically a primitive, so when it's a string or a numeric, again, they're kind of weird because they're objects in Ruby or whatever, we then want to freeze it. If it's a hash, we want to iterate through each of the objects in the hash, and for each of those we want to call deep freeze on the key and the value to make sure the key and the value of the hash aren't changed. And then we call object.freeze after we've done deep freeze on each of these. Or you can think maybe your key is an integer, so you're calling deep freeze. It comes back up to here with that integer for the key, which means now it's just this first case, which means we just call object.freeze. And then finally, we have the option where instead of it being a hash, it might be an array. If it's an array, we just go through each element and we call deep freeze on each element, which again, this might be a set of numbers, in which case we come back up here. We see it's just a regular number this time, so we use this first switch case, which gives us this object.freeze. And then finally, we have to finish this off by saying, if it's not one of these cases, we then can't freeze this object. Maybe you passed in like a dog or whatever is in your array. So your array has like the elements 1, 2, 3, and then I don't know, a poodle. Well, we can't deep freeze a poodle, so we throw an error here. And the final thing we want to note here is this is really bad code. So cyclic references will break this. So just as an aside, if you try to use this, you'll run into infinite recursion with this potentially. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you have an array and the array references an object and that object has an array and that array references this first object. You might end up in a back and forth situation where you just keep trying to deep freeze indefinitely and nothing works. But that's basically the gist of this little helper method that we're creating, right? So we want to be able to use this in our main Rails project. We can now come into our spec and our deepfreeze.spec, and then in here we can go ahead and test this. So inside of the deep freeze spec, the first thing we have to do is, let's just get rid of all of this. We want to include our deep freeze, and then we want to say, well, it needs to deep freeze a string. So we create a string, call deep freeze on it, and we expect the string to be frozen. So we just do that test. And then it's going to be a similar situation for numbers, where we pass in 42. We can then do another one for symbols. We can do another one for passing in a nil. Another one for booleans, which has 2 cases. I'm not really a fan of having 2 different assertions in a single thing, so you might want to break this out. Maybe do like it freezes true booleans and it freezes false booleans, right? Something like that. So it's a bit clearer when something fails, which one's failing. We can then say it deep freezes arrays. And then we have 3 assertions here. Can't really be helped. We need to test each of those cases. I'm too lazy to refactor it. We then have one that says, all right, it deep freezes hashes. So we create a hash. We have 4 assertions here. And then it needs to raise an error when it can't freeze an unsupported type. Again, if we're trying to deep freeze a poodle. So we pass in an unsupported object, which is an object.new, and we expect deep freeze to raise an error, which is a runtime error, which over here we can see it raises a error right here. So we can go ahead and save this. And now if we run a spec, if we, let me cd out of here. If we hit LL, we should be able to see that we are in the right directory. Let's do a bundle exec RSpec. We can see that we passed all these tests. So deep freeze, it freezes strings, numbers, symbols, nil, true booleans, false booleans, arrays, hashes, and it raises an error. So we passed 9 examples with 0 failures. So that's working. Let's go ahead and now commit our code. So we'll do a git add dot, git commit -m, implemented freezing, except for poodles. We can go ahead and do a git push. Type yes, hit Control L, come over here and refresh in case you don't believe me. And now you can see this has just been updated except for poodles. So now we've done that. We have our gem file. Let's go ahead and let's, I guess we can just minimize this. Let's cd out of our deep freeze project. Now we have this deep freeze. Let's go ahead and let's do a Rails new. We'll just call this the Rails app. And we'll just create a basic little Rails app here to now use this gem, because it's one thing to create a gem. It's another thing to actually use it. And we can take a look at how to do that. There's another way to host these, of course. You can push these up to Ruby gems. That's going to be a separate process. You're also going to want to make sure that you're not using some other gem's name. So like there is already, I think, a deep freeze gem. If we come in here, deep freeze gem Rails, maybe. Yeah, this one right here, deep dash freeze. Of course, you don't need everyone watching this to make a deep freeze gem. In fact, you probably don't even need the gem itself. It's just, you know, don't go making something that already exists. So you're going to want to deal with those conflicts. But okay, in this case, we have our Rails app. Let's go ahead and let's cd into this Rails app, run a code dot, and then let's go ahead and let's really quickly create the post scaffold. So we'll say, we'll say Rails G scaffold post with a title and a body of type text, just like that. Now we can do a Rails db :migrate command, and then we can hit F11 again to exit out of here. We can come into our gem file. Inside of our gem file, what we want to do is, let me hit F, well, let me just full screen this one. You're going to want to come down here to the bottom, and you're going to want to do a gem for whatever your gem is named. In my case, it's the deep_freeze gem. We can then hit a comma. This is going to be coming from Git, and I think it's called the deep freeze gem, right? Or did we call it something else? Let me check. Yeah, just deep freeze. So we have the deep freeze gem. It comes from a Git repo. So we're going to come up here to code, go over to SSH, copy the SSH. After the Git, we'll paste in whatever that link is. So git at github.com, your username / the name of your repo.git. This will now allow you to bundle this. It'll say, hey, do you trust this? We'll type yes. And then it should be good to use your gem. Of course, you're not going to be doing this for like publishing the package, but in this case, it's just a good getting started point. So we can now come over here into our app. Optionally, if you want to use your gem throughout your whole application, you can come into your config, your initializers, you can do a new file, and let's call this deep_freeze.rb. And in here, you want to require the deep_freeze. You can either do it here or you can do it per file. So like in our models and our post.rb, you could come up here and you could just do a require for deep_freeze, something like that. It really doesn't matter. You just have to do it in one of those places. Here, it's only going to work in your post. Here, it's going to work throughout your whole application. This will run when your application actually starts up. So you get the idea. If we run a Rails S real quick, should hopefully see that our server starts. We can come over to post/new. Let's create a test and a case post. You can see that's working. So now let's come in here and let's actually create this. First thing we need to do is include whatever we have in our gem. In this case, it's going to be the deep freeze. Then we say, all right, we need a list of allowed post titles, which is going to be a class variable. So it has double ats. It just means it's like, the way I always think of it is double ats is like static in a regular language. And then if you're in Ruby land, it's double ats for some reason. We can then do our validations. Our validations are just going to be validate title is allowed. So let's come down here and let's do this title is allowed validator. For the title is allowed, let me tap this over. You can see right here, title is allowed unless at allowed titles includes the title. And then errors.add title. This title is not in the list, with the list being printed right here. We can now create our initializer. So come up here, initialize end. Initialize takes in the attributes. We call super, so it does whatever it needs to in the parent constructor because we're overriding that. And then we can call our deep freeze method right here. And then if we just do this, we can come up here, refresh, new post, test, case, click create post. We can see title title is not in here. So maybe instead of doing that, we would want to do something like this, something like that. And then maybe put this inside of quotes, refresh, and we can do test and case, click create, and we can see title test is not included in the list, Mr., Mrs., whatever. You can come up here and say Mr. dot, and then case, click create post. That works just fine. Now let's do a new post, and let's try to modify this thing. So we'll call another method, which is just mutate allowed titles. And then in that mutate allowed titles, we have our @allowed titles. We're trying to push in test so that we can hopefully submit this. Let's save this. We can click create post. You can see here, can't modify frozen array. And even if we refresh, as soon as we come to this page, we're going to run into this error because our deep freeze isn't allowing us to do that. So you can see we're using the gem that we created just like you would expect to with any other gem, really. And a lot of the magic is sort of like demystified as soon as you go through this project, at least in like my eyes, seeing sort of how this all ties together. It's very, very helpful. Finally, you might want to come into your gems README and update it. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here that you might want to keep, you might want to change a bit, where you can see that by not changing our gem spec, we still have a lot of these to-dos here, and you know, some other stuff that you want to clean up. So you might want to go through and just make sure you've done that, especially after you push your stuff to, I guess before you push your stuff to Ruby Gems, but afterwards your README is probably going to have to change based on the URL, etc. But yeah, that's basically it. I just thought it might be helpful to cover this. I think coming up, I'm probably planning on also doing plugins like Rails engines and stuff like that. So yeah, if this was helpful, then, you know, I'm happy to help. Just let me know in the comments so I know to make more videos. And that's going to do it for this video. So thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.